Alright guys, in today's video we're going to be talking about the next generation consoles once again. More specifically, we're going to be taking some time here to focus on the SSD technology that both Microsoft and Sony are planning to implement into their next generation consoles. And I came across a very interesting report that I haven't seen many people talking about, and that is because this report could end up being wrong in the end. We don't know for sure, but they do point out some very interesting things here that could potentially point to the PlayStation 5 SSD potentially being 50% faster than the SSD that will be inside of the Xbox Series. So let's read this report and go over it, and then I want to give my thoughts and opinions on it. It says here, according to a report from PC Games N, it's looking like the Xbox Series SSD will be very much a current generation take on the technology and will be running at half the speed of the SSD in the PS5, which is built on cutting-edge Samsung tech. Dave James at PC Games N drew this conclusion after analyzing comments from a LinkedIn post from a former Phison employee. Phison are the company that had been contracted to supply the Xbox Series with its SSD. The fact that the SSD in the Xbox Series relies on very much established current generation PCIe 3.0/4.0 interface and is thus equivalent to the sort of speeds you'd get in a standard PCIe 3.0 NVMe drive that you can buy today has it lagging a fair way behind the cutting-edge Samsung SSD drive that Sony believes will allow it to compete with even the fastest PCs in a similar gaming space. So this is the quote they actually pulled from the article itself. Says here, but despite reports that the PS5 is going to have an SSD with raw bandwidth higher than any SSD available for PCs, it looks like the prototype Xbox Series consoles will have very much last-gen SSD speeds. A LinkedIn post from a former Phison employee has detailed the SSD controller that was installed into the Xbox Scarlett, and it's a chip that only supports sequential read-write speeds equivalent to a standard PCIe 3.0 NVMe drive. The Phison PS5019-E19T is a budget SSD controller that's been designed specifically to connect over the PCIe 4.0 interface, doesn't use a DRAM cache chip, and because it's essentially been based on a PCIe 3.0 controller, doesn't have the performance we'd expect from a pure strain PCIe 4.0 device. A pure strain PCIe 4.0 device. The fact that the SSD in the PS5 is so potentially screamingly fast should come as little surprise, not least because Sony sees a use for its PS5 SSD beyond banishing loading times. It wants to leverage PS5's SSD for low-level use, allowing the console to utilize portions of the SSD alongside system RAM. Now, before going any further, I do need to point out the fact that the individual who wrote up this article originally, where it's being sourced from PC Games N, does state that this could in fact change. They're going based off of prototypes, right? They're going based off of the Xbox Series prototype, so it is subject to change. However, it's seeming a little bit unlikely. This stuff, by this point in time, is definitely locked down. I mean, they could make some changes, but they don't have much room in that area because we are very much getting close to the launch of these consoles. Even though it is happening at the end of this year, to some people that may seem like, oh, there's still plenty of time. You have to understand all of the manufacturing and production that has to go behind this. So with that in mind, it's safe to say that pretty much everything's locked in at this point. And so what this is essentially saying, what it boils down to, is that the Xbox Series, based off of what this person has looked into, the digging they've done, is going to be utilizing current generation SSD technology, to where Sony, based off of everything we've been hearing and the reports we've seen in the past that they're partnering with Samsung for their technology, I think that's actually been confirmed if I'm not mistaken, they're planning on using cutting-edge next-gen SSD tech. And we could see a situation here, because the conversation has been so focused on overall power measured by T-flops when it comes to these consoles, and I stopped really talking about that too much because once you look into it, once you do a little bit of research and you kind of brush up on it, you start to realize that, I mean, yeah, T-flops, I guess, still matter to a certain extent, but it doesn't paint a very accurate picture like I've explained before, because when it comes to these consoles, they are highly customized. And what that ultimately is going to mean at the end of the day is how just in sync every component is with one another. A good example of this is if you look at the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X, both of these consoles are just PS4s and Xbox Ones with really upgraded GPUs, but everything else inside of the consoles has stayed exactly the same. And so because of that, it's a little bit out of balance. Developers can, I should say, do things with these consoles that they weren't able to do with the PS4 and Xbox One, but it's mainly just on a visual level in terms of resolution, right, and graphical fidelity and whatnot. But there's no denying that they're just out of balance, especially something like the Xbox One X, where it has this really beefed up GPU, but it's still being bogged down by that old CPU and that RAM, right? This time around, what Sony and both Microsoft are trying to strive for with their consoles is an overall balance. And it seems to me that Sony is banking more on what they will be able to do, what not them, but what developers will be able to do and what they'll be able to achieve with a very high-tech SSD, with a very fast, capable SSD. And it's going to be interesting because we don't know exactly what it will mean for games yet with Sony if they do in fact have a 50% faster SSD. You can only imagine it would probably be nothing but good things. And so we're seeing a situation where both of these consoles may be very similar in nature in what they're able to achieve. It seems to me that Microsoft may be pushing a little bit harder, and this makes sense for them to do this based off of what we've seen with the Xbox One X. They might be pushing a little bit harder for just overall GPU speed or GPU power. There have been some reports that have claimed that the GPU inside of the Xbox Series is not only a little bit more powerful than what we're going to see inside of the PlayStation 5, but also possibly a little bit faster. So we see maybe the differentiating factor here being that Microsoft is pushing harder for GPU speed and GPU power overall, and Sony may be cutting back a little bit on the GPU, but instead making up for it in a very significant way with an SSD, because we know that the SSD is going to have a big impact on games. In fact, this is one of the things that many developers have been discussing and talking about when talking about the next-gen consoles. And if you noticed, we've been hearing a lot more developers mention the PS5's SSD rather than the next Xbox console SSD, and this could be the reason why. It could be a much more advanced version, and because of that, developers may actually be able to do things with it that are just simply not possible on the Xbox Series. Now, I'm not trying to jump to any conclusions. Again, things could change, but one thing I do want to also point out before ending this video is that if you look at what Shuhei Yoshida has went on record saying, as well as Jim Ryan, they've both come out and said that developers are telling them they've had the easiest time ever developing games for the PlayStation 5. And you have to imagine that when I talk about them striving for an overall very balanced, well-balanced console between the RAM, the CPU, the GPU, the SSD, all of these things working in unison with one another and just being like, level with one another, that is probably a big reason why developers are having such an easy time developing for this console, and most likely the Xbox Series as well. But that's a very important thing, because what it ultimately comes down to, guys, is developers and how they're going to utilize the specifications that are inside of these consoles. Because when a console is not easy to develop for, or there are any roadblocks or anything, it's just not good, because it just means developers get frustrated, they get annoyed. Oftentimes they do find workarounds, but it does impede overall development. And so the smoother development goes for a console, the better the results are in the end, because the truth is, it doesn't just come down to raw specs all the time, regardless of what people want to believe. It comes down to how developers are able to really draw from that, right? What they're able to achieve with that. And that's why when I hear about this, a SSD being inside the PS5 that could potentially be completely cutting edge, maybe even 50% faster than what will be in the next Xbox, it gets me incredibly excited to see what specifically first-party developers or any developers who are developing games exclusively for the PS5, what they're going to be able to do with that, because something tells me this could be an area where you see a big difference between the Xbox Series and the PlayStation 5. But we are going to have to wait to see about that. I thought you guys would find this incredibly interesting. To me, it's one of these things where we're going to have to wait and see, but this report, it seems like the individual did do their homework, and they, pretty much found out who the supplier is for the Xbox Series SSD, and they drew some conclusions here, and so we're going to have to see if it turns out to be true. If it does end up being true, then I could see this maybe being a big differentiating factor. We have heard that something Sony's really going to be going in hard with and leaning into with their marketing is the overall speed of the PS5. So it's going to be very interesting. Let me know your thoughts about this down in the comments below. I will be very interested to hear what you guys have to say. Be sure to leave the video a like if you did enjoy it. Really helps it out. Lets me know you guys enjoy the content. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and haven't already. Hit the bell notification icon so you never miss an upload, and feel free to share this video out on top of all that. But until next time, guys, take care.